When our oldest daughter became bat mitzvah, it was November of 2016. This was a time of great moral crisis for our nation. And I stood right here in this place on that Shabbat, and I shared a story from Rabbi Nachman, the story of the tainted grain. Some of you remember this story well. There was once a village in which the grain harvest was contaminated, and everyone who ate from it went mad. Two friends in that town sat together contemplating what they should do. We could scramble and store up enough good grain for the year so that we won't have to eat from the blighted harvest, one of them suggested. But, the other pointed out, we could not possibly collect enough for everyone in this village to eat. And if we store up enough for just the two of us, then we'll be the only sane ones in the town. And everyone will look at us and think that we're the ones who have gone mad. Maybe, they wonder, they should just refuse to eat altogether. But then surely they would die of hunger. Confounded, the two friends ultimately determine that they have no choice but to eat the tainted grain. But before they do, they will put a mark on their heads, a sign, so that one of them sees the other, they'll at least remember that they've gone mad, that this is not normal. I love this story. I reject this story's conclusion. We cannot allow ourselves to go hungry, and we must not eat the tainted grain. So what then are we to do? I would like to welcome you to the latest installment of my ongoing series, Who Are We Called to Be as Jews and Human Beings in a Time of Great Moral Crisis? I want to suggest on this Shabbat that Yitro, the strangely and surprisingly prominent character in this parasha that speaks of the giving of the Ten Commandments, Yitro, the priest of Midian and the father-in-law of Moses, embodies one of the answers to this question for our time. To understand how, we have to now turn back to the beginning of the book of Shmot, the book of Exodus. Pharaoh, you may remember, was deeply threatened by the thriving Israelite population in Egypt, and he conceived of multiple tactics to quash both the body and the spirit of the people, whom he saw as a fifth column, unwelcome intruders in the land. He tormented and he enslaved our ancestors. He appointed brutal taskmasters who made their lives bitter, who forced upon them labor with crushing harshness. When the people continued to thrive and flourish, nevertheless, Pharaoh decreed that the newborn Hebrew baby boys would be murdered on the birth stool, a demand that the Hebrew midwives flatly refused. Finally, Pharaoh commanded the entire people that every son that was born would be thrown into the river. But the rabbis in Masechet Sota want us to know that Pharaoh did not hatch these evil decrees on his own. No, he consulted with a close set of advisors, each of whom was met later in life, midah keneged midah, measure for measure, with a fate that matched the nature of their advice to Pharaoh. So who were these advisors? One was Bil'am, whom we'll meet later in the book of Numbers. Bil'am strongly endorsed Pharaoh's murderous plan. And just as he sanctioned the murder of Hebrew babies, so 2 years later would Bil'am be killed in the Israelite campaign against Midian. Job, is the second advisor. Job hears Pharaoh's declaration of the plan, and Job is silent. He says nothing. He nods in assent and goes on to tune out the anguished cries of the population in return for remaining silent in the face of other suffering, his own immeasurable suffering, told later in the Tanakh, is met with stony silence. Pharaoh's third advisor is Yitro. Unlike Bil'am, Yitro is pained by the proposed cruelties to the Hebrews. Unlike Job, he understands that his silence would render him complicit. So he takes the only course of action that he can think of. He steps before Pharaoh and he declares, Al tishlach yadcha bam. Do not stretch your hand out to harm this people. Have we not seen that God is with them always? Do not harm them. Stop trying to destroy them. Or, he says, at the very least, send them away. Let them return to their home in Canaan. Just do not harm this people, for they are innocent. I want to ask us on this Shabbat to take a moment to digest this singular act of courage. It was well known in the ancient world that to voice protest against Pharaoh, a powerful, despotic ruler, was almost certainly a death sentence. And indeed, when Yitro spoke these words, Pharaoh immediately flew into a rage. Yitro barach. And Yitro, understanding the danger he now faced, was forced to flee for his life. By the time we meet Yitro for the first time, years later, when Moses himself flees to Midian, he is already known as Kohen Midian, the priest of the place. He's a religious leader. He has a wife. He has 7 daughters. But Yitro's decision to speak out against Pharaoh was actually at great personal sacrifice. Not only did he lose his job, he had to forego his position as Pharaoh's senior advisor, but he went on to endure years of suffering, derision, and hostility. The Midrash fills in some of the gaps of the story for us. There's a reason that Yitro's daughters had to pasture to the family flocks, the rabbis write. It was because Yitro had been completely ostracized by his neighbors, who feared retribution from Pharaoh, whose power extended even all the way to Midian. So the Midrash tells us they arose and they decreed that no one should have any ties with this man. No one should perform labor for him. No one should even herd his flocks. Even still, Yitro refused to eat the tainted grain. And for this brave act, the willingness to hold tightly to his core values, even at great personal risk, Yitro is ultimately rewarded midah keneged midah. His descendants will become justices on the high court, the Sanhedrin. Of course, we know that the legacy of each of Pharaoh's 3 advisors persists to this day. Like Bil'am, some have chosen, and I'm afraid that many more will choose in the days ahead, to match the tyrant's cruelty with their own. These are both ideologues and opportunists. They have already adopted a steady diet of tainted grain. They smirk through a press conference when the tyrant confers upon them ill-begotten gains, like schoolyard bullies being rewarded for their cruelty. They stand to get very rich off of the fats of the estate, and yet they sleep well at night, minimizing, downplaying, even justifying the cruelties and excesses, ceding all moral authority to the regime. Some, like Job, will succumb to the pressure and will choose to stay silent. They will obey in advance, preemptively ceding to the abuses of the tyrant. Even the most egregious of abuses do not awaken this sleeping mass, not the threat of family separation or mass forced deportation and exile, not the targeting of the most vulnerable among us or the overturning of sacred, long-established norms, nothing. I want to be careful here and say that there are decent people in this camp, the camp of the silent. Job himself was tam v'yashar. He was blameless and upright, a person who feared God and shunned evil. We have to ask why it is that decent people would so willingly cede to an ideological extremism that in another time, in different circumstances, they would find objectively absurd. Some in this camp are driven by righteous motivations. They don't want to starve. What choice do they have but to eat the tainted grain? M. Gessen brilliantly dissected this camp in an essay last week. For some, their anticipatory obedience grows out of the fear of collective punishment. If I speak out, God forbid, this newspaper or this church or this shul might be shuttered. Some are motivated by the greater good argument. As Gessen points out, this is the logic of some hospital administrators already discontinuing gender-affirming care in order to protect their federal funding. Some are silent out of a reasoned pragmatism. What's the point of cashing in my political chips when I can already see the way that the wind is blowing? Why take the risk? I would put in this category the chilling game week decision of the NFL officials to preemptively remove the long-standing end racism message from the end zone before the Super Bowl, in case it might offend one particular spectator. All of these folks tell themselves, even as they eat the tainted grain, that they're not like the others. They'll never be like the others. They're just doing what they need to do to survive. But no matter what drives them, and despite the goodness of their hearts, it is the silence of this group, the majority of us, after all. It is their willingness to conform and consent that clears the path for the tyrant and his ideological acolytes to run roughshod over the nation. As Gessen writes, there are many good reasons to accommodate budding dictators, and only one reason not to. Anticipatory obedience is a key building block of their power. The autocracies of the 20th century relied on mass terror. Those of the 21st century often don't need to. Their subjects comply willingly. But then there's Yitro, a quiet counter-testimony to the greed and the bluster, to the self-protection and to the silence. Yitro reminds us that we must not eat the tainted grain, no matter how hungry we get in the days ahead. Instead, we must find another food source. There is always another food source. Yitro knew that he would likely be killed, or at best forced from his position, forced from his home, if he were to challenge Pharaoh. I suspect he must even have known that his words would not land the impact that he hoped for. Pharaoh's machinery of rage and violence was already steaming down the path toward enslavement and even murder. So why then did Yitro take the risk and speak out? Yitro spoke because he had to. And we too must speak out. Because doing so is the only power that we have to stop this engine from heading off the edge of the abyss. And like Yitro, we must know that even if we fail, speaking out is essential to maintaining our integrity. It is essential to maintaining our humanity. And remember, the fact that this parasha, the parasha of divine revelation, is named after an outsider, after an idolater, begs us to uncover this timeless message. Ibn Ezra posits that Yitro is centered in our text right at this critical moment before the revelation of Torah, only to stand in juxtaposition and contradistinction to Amalek, the evil warriors who attacked Israel at the end of the previous parasha. From this, we learn, they argue, an important lesson about the other. They are not all our enemies. They are not all out to destroy us. And that is true. And that is a worthy and humbling lesson, especially for a people that has suffered so profoundly. But I want to suggest that Yitro comes not only to teach us a lesson about them, the other, the outsider, but also about ourselves. We are called not only to appreciate Yitro, the wise and humble Gentile, we are called to become Yitro, to find the clarity, to find the courage to speak when the whole world around us grows eerily silent, to recognize that even in the face of grave personal threat, our choices matter. Our decision to act or our failure to do so, our decision to speak or our decision to remain silent, to stand out or to hide, will reverberate for generations to come. Moses must have realized this himself. Why else, when he fled Pharaoh, did he go straight to Midian, the place of Pharaoh's former advisor. This was no accident. The moment Moses' own conscience is awakened, he knows that he needs to find community among others who, like him, could no longer play by the rules of the corrupt system. So he seeks out Yitro, not only as a father-in-law, but as a safe haven, as a mentor, a guide in the practice of courageous resistance. With Yitro, Moses is deprogrammed. His soul is nourished. He's able to begin to heal. He's introduced to the long arc of history, an arc that began for both men with violence and estrangement and alienation and expulsion, and places both men in this parasha that we read today on the path to redemption. May we remember the lesson of Yitro. We must not eat the tainted grain. The story of this humble priest calls us in the distorted, contorted reality of our time and says, resist the temptation. Do not quiet your intuition when something terribly wrong is unfolding before your eyes. If together we refuse the foul grain, if we defy the new norms, if we insist on living not from our most callous political calculations, but from our deepest moral values, if we hold fast to the dream of an inclusive and just and fair society, if we commit to taking care of each other, then and only then might we be able to navigate this challenging time with some measure of hope for a better future. Shabbat Shalom.